Given the horrors of Hamas, the continuing missing hostages, and the countless innocent lives being lost in Gaza, we here in the United States are clinging to our sense of humanity. We all want to do something, and instead are stuck in our feelings of despair, rage, and fear. We're seeing an overwhelming rise in anti-Semitism, an increase in Islamophobic incidents. So tonight, we felt that we needed to just gather. At the very least, we wanted to gather. We know we're going to have an incredible conversation, but at the core, we needed to be here. We needed to be in a place that honors humanity and teaches the perils of escalating hatred and honors a Jewish story. We could not think of a better place than the Holocaust Museum LA. We are post-Holocaust generation, descendants and students of survivors. Our lessons of Judaism are inextricably linked to feelings of tikkun olam, ensuring a just and safe world. I was already a follower of Eric Ward's writings on anti-Semitism when I first met him in person. He said that to understand how social movements grew, you had to look to society's margins. The margins would eventually make their way to the center. Today, we will look at the margins, where the Nazi punks and their punk rock resistors lived and fought. At Reboot, we also listen and gather the margins. In this case, it is the artists, storytellers, and culture makers, the empaths among us who see what others don't and help shine a light for the rest of us to follow. With Reboot Ideas, we're having these conversations in a public forum. With the social media landscape and ecosystem of flattening dialogue, we hope that you will join Reboot Ideas for the nuanced conversations grounded in Jewish and human values. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce this panel, and then Jake will introduce the film. I'm going to abridge their bios as you can grab those off the internet at our website, rebooting.com. So John Baer decided this morning, or maybe today at 3, to join us on this panel, and we feel so grateful. He grew up in Portland, Oregon, and his teen years actively confronted white supremacist gangs there, and he'll tell us more about that. He had a tragic encounter that escalated into a gunfight. Baer inadvertently shot and killed the lead singer of a neo-Nazi rock band. He spent his 20s in prison and on parole. Now living in LA, he continues to be an activist against fascism with a deep understanding about the inherent consequences of violence. He's also a proud father of 5 children. Jacob Kornbluth, he won a Primetime Emmy for his work on the Showtime series Years of Living Dangerously and was awarded a special jury prize for excellence in filmmaking from the Sundance Film Institute. He founded Inequality Media with Robert Reich. His videos have been viewed close to 1 billion times on social media. Molly Newman is a musician who has performed in such influential bands as Bratmobile, the Frumpies, and the Peaches. She was a pioneer of the early to mid-90s Riot Girl movement, penning the zine which coined the phrase in its title. And last but not least, Jessica Yellin, who is the founder of News Not Noise. And as Guy said, she's an incredibly sound and measured voice, a source-based voice in this time. And so I'm riffing off of my bio for her because I think that is such a treasure that she's offering us right now. She's an independent media brand that provides news across digital platforms for a busy audience. She's the former chief White House correspondent for CNN and an award-winning political correspondent for ABC, MSNBC, and CNN. And you'll learn more about Eric Ward because he's featured in this film. And I encourage you all to look up his writings. And thank you so much for gathering today and just being human and curious and learning together. And with that, Jake, I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you, Francine, and thank you, Guy, and the Holocaust Museum. I have to say, for just on a personal level, being with you in this room right now feels just incredibly special to me. It's something that I need, to be with people, and to share this film with you is something that's a beautiful experience for me. So thank you for being here. I want to introduce this film by giving you a nugget of the origin story that led me to make it. It's 11 minutes. It won't take long to watch the movie, so I'll try to keep the intro shorter than the film. But in my family, in my extended family, is a QAnon conservative. At holidays, we gather. This doesn't come up that much. We eat whatever we eat, and we go home, and we tend to not talk about politics. But a few years ago, I wasn't there, and my wife was at a gathering, and they said that your husband, to my wife, is a propagandist who will do anything for money. And I was raised by communist parents. A defining feature of my life is doing nothing that will make me money. So I had no other way to understand this criticism other than they thought what they perceived of me as a Jew. And I hadn't thought that much about anti-Semitism to that point. But this came up at the same time that Kyrie Irving was saying some anti-Semitic things, and Kanye, now Ye, was saying some anti-Semitic things. And I started to think, oh my God, I don't understand what's happening right now. I don't understand in my own family what's happening. I don't understand where this is coming from. I have to understand this more. That question is what led to the journey that made the film. We'll come back and talk more about it afterwards.
Jake, I just have to start with you and say this is so prescient and powerful. It's remarkable that you saw this however long ago you started and are bringing it to us at this time. I just want to highlight some things in the film before we just start. We're going to have a conversation, and then I'm going to open it up to your questions, so you'll get a chance to ask what's on your mind. At one point, Eric Ward said, anti-Semitism, let's see, wait, you know what? I'm now that age. Sorry. Take two. Eric said, anti-Semitism denies the grievances of a people who want a better society. And I think this film shows us that there are allies out there and hope for building an anti-hate coalition. And I think we can get there in this conversation. I'd like to start by asking you the most basic thing, which is, somebody sets out to make a film about anti-Semitism. The punk ska scene in Portland isn't the natural starting place. So how did you end up telling this story?
Well, first, to pick up from the intro to the film, there was this question I had, which was what was changing in the sense of Jew hatred out there. I wasn't aware of it in a way that was scary to me as somebody who pays attention all the time, and I felt something moving, and I wanted to know what it was. So I was searching for that, and I got a list of experts to talk to from Reboot, who we've heard some about tonight, and Eric was one of them, and I asked him sort of like, what am I not getting? What's the thing that I don't get? And he mentioned that story about the mass shootings. And the mass shootings for me were terrifying me aside from the anti-Semitism. Like, I was just scared of the rise in mass shootings and what I perceived to be the rise in hate generally in the public discourse. So he said all of these shootings of black people, of Latino people, of Jews are anti-Semitic. And I said, I don't believe you. I'm going to go check myself. And I went on the internet and I looked at the, what do they call them, the manifestos, hate manifestos. And I started to see these the mention of replacement theory, the sense that Jews were, the enemy, all these things. And my jaw sort of dropped. I didn't know that. Called back Eric. I said, okay, let me get in and understand this better. And what I realized was the only way I could understand this story was by putting myself in the mindset of a white nationalist, as terrifying as that sounds, and thinking to myself, what are they seeing that connects these things to them so naturally that I don't see? And what I saw when I started reading and thinking about this, and through my conversations with Eric, honestly, was that they were othering all these groups. We might not see that from the inside. We might not, as Jews or as whatever, pick your subculture group, we might not see that, but they saw us all as the other. And until it's not up to us was the interesting thing. And when I talked to some of my anti-racist activist friends, they're like, duh, in a way. Like, of course, if you're black, you see this easily. Like, power names you. as the other. You don't get to say, hey, wait a second, this doesn't match my identity. They name you in some way. And that was a revelation to me, and I felt like I was grateful to learn it. But Eric, I was like, you're a black non-Jew. How did you get to be such an expert in this stuff? And, you know, he and I had come up in the punk scene peripherally myself, and he started telling me his stories of going to these punk shows. And I think when you came at it from, you know, he's a respected intellectual thought leader in kind of philanthropic and sort of heady spaces like the ones we're in right now. But I don't think he'd had that much opportunity to talk about his punk roots. And here's a guy who had lived experience, visceral, real experience in what it felt like to push back against hate that led him to fight against anti-Semitism. And I was like, I want to know more about that. And that's what led me to the story.
So cool. Well, unfortunately, Eric does have COVID, so he's home, but we have him by Zoom and we have Pan by Zoom. So I thought we could try to bring them into the conversation and hear from them early. Can you all are they able to go up on the screen or? There we go. Hi.
Hey.
Hey, folks. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person, but it's great to hear this conversation happening, and it's great to be here with Molly, John, and Pan, and of course the great folks at Reboot.
Eric, first, your voice is so powerful. Thank you for what you bring and for being here despite not feeling so hot. Let me just ask you, as Jake says, you are not Jewish, you are black. How did you come to see this connection between anti-Semitism and racism and feel so comfortable speaking about it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I grew up at a time, and a unique time in the United States. It was the end of segregation, right? I'm old enough that I was born at a time where legally I wasn't considered a full human being by the law in this country. And then came this civil rights movement. And following it was desegregation. And a lot of us, particularly working class and working poor, were kind of thrown into these new environments. And we had to kind of figure out a way to get along and to find community. And it wasn't going to be around the differences in our race or gender. That wasn't going to be it. And luckily for us, we had these new music that was arising, at least for us, punk and hip hop, and it created a space for like new rules. People didn't care so much what race you were or what your gender or sexual orientation. You know, folks wanted to know what kind of music you were into, right? What neighborhood you were from. That's what mattered. And so, you know, what happens ultimately is the folks we were fleeing from, right? The bullies, the racists, the society that didn't care about us, soon turned their attention onto our subculture and started to attack the only place we had to call home, the only place we didn't feel alienated, or if we were alienated, we were all alienated. And so really, it's hard to explain, but for many of us, it was the closest thing to family that many of us would ever have, and it was under attack. And the folks who were attacking it, you know, at first, you know, there wasn't much ideology. It was just what I call just basic bigotry. But soon it started to take like ideological form. Folks started calling themselves white power skinheads, white power punks. And at the forefront of their ideology was a hatred of Jews. And so for me, early on, anti-Semitism for me was another assault on the community that I called home. And that's what made me lean into it. It wasn't, the last thing I'll say is what was unique about it was it wasn't like there wasn't bigotry in the punk scene, right? It wasn't kind of this beautiful utopia, though it was a beautiful space. But this was different. It was bigotry being organized to push the rest of us out of that space. They wanted to take it over.
I'm curious, one more question to you, Eric, so that you can get some rest. Is there a lesson you learned from that about what it takes to form an anti-hate coalition?
Yeah, you have to be willing to break out of your own silos, right? You have to be willing to form another identity that is as strong as the identities that society lays over us, right? These differences, and when you find them in subcultures, that identity, you have to then protect it, right? You have to protect it from organized racists and organized bigots, because they'll see that subculture as a threat. It's a threat because it's an actual alternative to their division and bigotry. And so the lesson is, right, to everyone who is listening, everyone in this room comes out of some subculture. I don't care if it's a quilting club, I don't care if it's skateboarding, I don't care if it's food culture, DJs, bikers, whatever you are, there is a subculture you sit in. And you need to turn to that subculture in this moment and start having this conversation. We're seeing these attacks on mixed martial arts, right? We're seeing these attempts, right, to co-opt and take over subcultures, cosplay, Dungeons and Dragons, online gaming. And the best thing I can tell the folks is look at how the punk scene fought to protect itself. Not always successful, not always the best ways, but there are lessons there. And those lessons can be used to defend your communities and defend your subcultures. That's the important message.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. Can you tell him to take zinc and vitamin D? Okay. Jake, I think that there's more to be said about the subculture, how Nazism flourished in it, the folks who decided to resist, what brought them into that. And I think Pan is available.
Yeah, Pan, you got a minute? Can we hit you with the question? I know it's gone a little over. Hey, so Pan, thanks for joining us, taking the time. I thought it was a real honor to get to sit down and talk with you when I came up to Portland and we were doing the shoot. And I was struck by the fact of how much you had to say that I felt like you hadn't had a chance to say, or that you didn't feel comfortable enough saying. Like, people weren't listening in a way to, or maybe you weren't comfortable saying it. I don't know if it's not they weren't listening, if you weren't saying it. It's tough to say how to connect those things. But I'm curious about those firsthand experiences, because when we were talking, you talked about being the guy outside the drag show, or I think I was hearing the story of you being outside a drag show in Portland and being security so that they could have their drag show inside when the neo-Nazis were threatening the LGBTQ community in Portland. And you were the guy who they called to guard the house when a Jewish family felt under threat by the neo-Nazis and the cops wouldn't come to guard it. So that firsthand experience, that experience you went through, it got flipped, right? I think people were telling a story about you that you didn't think was true. So I want to hear about how and why you decided to talk now, and why, when you were fighting hate so hard, the only story that was coming out was that you guys are the perpetrators of hate. I wonder how that felt to you and what you have to say about that.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor. I've never been to the Holocaust Museum in LA, but I have in Jerusalem, and it's a pretty intense experience for me, but where was. Yeah, I think that, the scary part about this is going outside your silos, to reach on what Eric said. We really had to cross bridges and introduce ourselves and incorporate ourselves with people in a wider sort of scheme of things. And that was helpful. But I also think that for me, I couldn't be, being a Jew and growing up in a Jewish family and having family that had to run from persecution in Russia and that died in the Holocaust. There's nothing I can do about it, but you see the ramifications of that sort of vibrate through generations. And there was an opportunity for me to draw a line in the sand and say, not today, not tomorrow, never again. And I did. And I think part of that, like I was touching on earlier, is reaching across silos. We had to build a network, and it gets very complicated when you do that because you have to be very articulate. You have to be very educated and wise to many levels of things, and be able to argue. And it was a lot simpler just to live an anti-racist lifestyle or to live my example rather than have to try to explain it all the time. I think that now it's important for me. I think that I didn't really know how much my life has affected others, and I've been told numerous times that I need to speak out, and so I'm doing what I can to actually do that and share my story. But I think that, for me, living the lifestyle is a lot simpler because the enemy is like a paper mache, right? They're not as scary as you think they are. They're like human beings. They're scared. The punk scene got infiltrated because people like Tom Metzger, Klansmen, and people with political objectives found a group of people that were easily manipulated, poor people. And, poor people have typically been set against each other. And that's what I think happened, or what I know that happened. But, just to touch on something now, like with everything that's going on in the Middle East, I can't even go on my Instagram feeds or my Facebook feeds without seeing people who I thought were allies saying things that are offensive. I mean, and I'm not going to get political, but it's just, you have to be careful what you say, and you have to be careful who you talk to, or do you? It was easier for me when I was a kid to just draw the line and to fight. And that was something that I could do. If I was around in the 40s, I would have been in the resistance, or I would have joined the, airborne. So for me, this is the journey, learning to tell my story. So.
Well, just one last thing then. What would you want people to learn from your experience? What could you share that would help people who are now struggling with what to do?
Oh my God, I'm jumping out of my skin to say this. Winning the fight is not necessarily beating up your enemy or destroying your enemy. Winning the fight is getting in the ring, stepping in the ring, whether that is with your fist, or whether that's with your mouth, or whether that's with your wallet, or whether that's with your volunteer time. Get in the ring. Get in the ring. That's what I learned. Get in the ring.
Thank you, Pan. Thank you for and thank you for being a part of this.
It's been an honor.
Take care. Have a great show tonight. I know you're headlining tonight, right?
Yeah, I got to run down to the club right now.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool.
Oi.
Cool. That's great. That's great. Let's bring it back into the room. And John, I'd love to bring you into the conversation and ask you about when you first encountered Nazis. It's so weird for me to say that sentence, but you did. What in your view drew them to their ideology, and what made you decide to resist?
I think, we always had some assholes in our scene here and there, but at some point they started to identify as, white power punks, white power skinheads, Nazis. And I remember at first I was just like, where's this coming from? Like, I didn't even understand it. And I think that, bigger, more organized groups co-opt these movements, kind of like they talked about in the film. And, and like when Eric talked about how they were trying to kind of co-opt our punk and skinhead movements, and they have a message that resonates with people about, the reason that you can't get a job is because, the Jews are pulling the strings, or, I also, I've been kind of thinking about this as the film's been going, and I think that for white racists who hate black people, who hate brown people, it's a little convenient to to not feel like the civil rights movement was a victory for the black people and the brown people, but that strings were being pulled like by the puppet master Jewish people. Like the Jewish conspiracy, I think, can somehow allow the white racists to still feel that they're superior. You know, it's like they dismiss the, like, you know.
And what drew you to the resistance? How old were you when you encountered this, and why did you decide to take up that fight?
Oh man, I was a teenager. You know, Pan and I grew up together. We lived together before we became skinheads, and you know, when Nazis started showing up in the scene, it was like they're attacking my community. They're attacking my friends. They're attacking people I care about. We had friends who were gay. We had friends who were black. We had friends who were Jewish. You know, we were either going to fight or give up the scene, you know?
Right, it wasn't so political. It was sort of like, don't rag on my friends.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. And you know, as time went on, we started to recognize this thread that exists through all of it, you know, which is anti-Semitism.
I want to turn to another concept in the film, which was this idea of a multiracial formation or resistance. You talk in the film about an anti-hate coalition at the very end. So I thought we could listen to a clip of Mike Crenshaw, who we saw in the film, but it's something else he said, who also fought the white supremacists.
I start to see images of swastikas as a kid in grade school, and I immediately identify, oh, that's powerful. As a kid, everybody wanted to play cops and robbers, good guys, bad guys, cowboys and Indians, and you just think about that. What do all those polemics represent, dichotomy, you know, what does that represent? It represents power and the powerless, right? And everybody always wanted to be the most powerful. We all had toy guns. We always wanted to be army men and all this shit, right? So first time I see pictures of swastikas in Time Life books, right? And seeing the Nazi, I don't understand what I'm seeing, but what I understand is that's powerful. That's power, right? It took me years to understand, not because anyone was explaining it with clarity. It was just like a footnote. Oh yeah, that was World War II, there was a Holocaust, they killed a lot of Jewish people. And so later, after Roots, we watched the Holocaust, right? And I'm watching the trains in the Holocaust and this image of Jewish people being forced onto these cargo cars on these freight trains that are shipping them to concentration camps. And I remember sitting there thinking, I got something in common with those people. There's something I can relate to what I'm observing that's happening to these people in this historical recreation of this mini-series or whatever the fuck you want to call it. There's something about what's happening to them, and that same shit in a different way happened to me. And I would ask the question, why? If there's only 5 or 6 armed guards, but there's 150 people getting on that car, why don't they fucking take out the guards? So all these things are circulating in my mind. My ideas of self and identity, I'm struggling to feel at home in my own body. I don't know why, but I know who the enemy is now. You know, 16 years old, I'm like, anybody that's not gonna allow me to be myself, as hard as I'm trying to figure out how to be comfortable trying to be myself, anybody that's gonna feel comfortable telling me I can't be myself, fuck you. I'm gonna fight you, like, on sight. And I happened to fall in the punk scene with some other people, and we didn't even know we all felt that way until the fucking Nazis showed up. 16, these Nazis show up, and we're like, you guys are Nazis?
So what did you learn from Mike's perspective?
Well, you know, part of how I make films, some people make it when they're an expert and they just have something they want to say. I like to go on a learning journey in my films. I like to feel something and not know the answer to the question at the end of the day. And I wanted to show that clip because I felt like I jumped into his perspective and I understood the connection between being named by the dominant culture as the other and the sense of power and the way that the music felt empowering, the community felt empowering to push back. I was, you know, I grew up, I grew up in a Dominican and Puerto Rican neighborhood, communist parents, really, really poor. And I remember thinking like, that it just, whatever your version is of feeling powerless, you tap into it in some way, and then then the music comes and it speaks to your rage and it speaks to your anger or something, and you feel like you found community. And I heard that in what he was saying. All those kind of like signals of where power was and how your relationship was to it that you were getting from these things. I remember those things in my own kind of experience, and it felt like there was a simpatico relationship, right? He was plugging in some way to like, it's scary when he talks about the swastika being powerful, terrifying to me, and also like he's thinking about power a lot as a black kid, growing up in Minneapolis, punk black kid who doesn't feel like he has a home. Anyway, empathy is what it's all about at the center of it. It's like seeing some of your own experience in somebody's experience who's very different than you, and that's what I heard when I heard him say that stuff.
Molly, you were in the Riot Girls, and in a surprise to no one, Nazism in the punk movement also comes with sexism and misogyny. Would you
It
tell
might
us
have
a
been
little?
a surprise, though, I think, when we were sort of starting our band and starting to sort of ask for space, because it really was something that people responded to with shock, that we needed to see more women on stage, and we needed to see more women making music, and there wasn't, I don't believe, that recognition of that absence, which was really the main motivator for us, wanting to start playing music and start our bands and get inspire hopefully other people. That was a lot of the motivation.
So would you talk a little bit about what you saw from a gender lens?
Yeah, so so just a little personal anecdote and my connection to Eric Ward too. So I was a student at the University of Oregon, and Eric, a couple of years ahead of me, but was also there. And I'm from Washington, D.C., and had been very passionate about like learning about fighting racism. And the summer that I started college was the summer Huey Newton died, and I think Do the Right Thing had come out. There was a lot of sort of big moments around, sort of like calling out racism and just connection of historical sort of activism. And I got to college, and I had an art teacher back at home, and I kind of wrote to him, who was black, and I wrote to him sort of saying, I'm learning about all of these things, that I want to do all of this work and, really try to, fight this injustice. And he wrote me back, these were letters also, which is so cute. And he wrote me back, and he said, that's great for you to do, but, I encourage you to think about your position as a woman and all of the what's not available to you, and all of the things that sort of keep you, or I can't remember the actual language off the top of my head, but that was the message, was like, think about yourself as a woman and what, how this fits all together. And Eric was, I think, doing that work, and I some of the pictures that were in the film, I almost like reminded me of like where I met him, with the dreads, and there were some meetings that he had, and I think just having that opportunity to think about the fact that there were so few women making music, there was so much to still fight together, with racism. It was the Gulf War was starting. There were a lot of dynamics, fighting for Roe, and apartheid, was ending in South Africa. There was just so many different sort of things that connected activism that gave me personally an opportunity to sort of try to find my voice. I'm a drummer actually, so I wasn't the singer, but
Make some noise.
yeah, to make noise and to find a way to really recognize that there wasn't much space for women.
And how do you think you were able to succeed fighting the Nazism?
Pardon, sorry, could you repeat
How
that?
did you succeed in fighting back against the sexism and misogyny?
Well, I think it was more that we were not calling that piece out as much as taking space. So I think if you look at some of the, and John, I love your perspective, and Eric too, like, you know, there weren't, girls, and especially in skinhead environment, were like really relegated to the back in most cases. There
Not
were
welcome.
Honestly, we had a couple girls in our group that made us a better group.
Awesome.
But they dealt with misogyny and sexism.
There were a lot of sort of anecdotes that you would hear about, especially in hardcore, you know, in the late 80s and early 90s, around, you know, like, hold my coat, you know, get, like, I'm going in, I'm the one who's gonna go, you know, sort of like be in the middle of it, and you know, we finding our own power and, you know, sort of like claiming it, were, you know, definitely had, you know, that was not acceptable. That dynamic was not gonna work.
Jake, you know, there are a lot of lessons we can draw from the film and from the voices of the remarkable people in it. I want to play one more clip before we talk about that. Can we play the clip of the rabbi with Eric?
There's an awkwardness about calling out Jew hatred from a Jewish perspective. You're saying that you're seeing anti-Semitism or Jew hatred as racism. One of the issues for Jews is I don't think of myself as a race.
Yeah.
I think of myself as a part of a people with many racial backgrounds. Black people are Jewish, you know. So it's just a confusing stirring of the pot on a personal basis.
You can't fight anti-Semitism without fighting anti-blackness, right, in American society, because anti-blackness is the construction of race in America. But the truth is we can't fight anti-blackness as a form of racism without taking on anti-Semitism, because it's the narrative, that racialized narrative of anti-Semitism, that has us all not seen, right, as having legitimacy or credibility.
To name it for its power, as Eric does, I think is a very important step. It's not just about us. It's not just about the Jews. It's about all of the other groups as well.
Powerful. Have they known each other?
They, I think in the time you were at college, we're at a gathering, a screening of some film, and neo-Nazis stormed the film, and Eric said, everybody get inside, this is gonna get bad. 15 neo-Nazis came, and this Rabbi Yitz, wouldn't go in. He stayed outside, and he's like, I ain't moving. And there was 15 neo-Nazis came up, and Eric and him stood, and they had like a moment, and he's like, they're coming for you, man, you know, like, go inside. And he's like, I ain't moving. And this formed a lifelong friendship for those two. I got to hear about that. It was an amazing story. It still gives me goosebumps to talk about. They wound up bringing the neo-Nazis into the film. The rabbi walked these neo-Nazis around and had them talk to Jews. They said, you can come, but if you start fighting, I'm gonna fight you back. And we got more of us than there are of you. So come on in and let's see how it goes. And these guys came in, and the rabbi, this is crazy, and we weren't able to put it in the film, but the rabbi wound up, the leader of that 15-person neo-Nazi, I think they were armed, he said, I had no idea. I guess he only saw the person, and he saw them as just damaged people. He didn't see the weapons, but these guys had machine guns. They had knives, and he invited them into the screening. And then the leader of that group wound up becoming an anti-hate activist. He flipped them. So it's an amazing story of their friendship. And that rabbi also gave, he gave one of the last talks at the Tree of Life synagogue before it got shut up. So at the Friday, I think it happened, I forget, my days are, it's right around the 5-year anniversary now, but he was on my radar for those two reasons. And it was an amazing conversation that just didn't fit into the film, but this was something that we saw. But I wanted to show this clip because it shows a lot of I think the struggle that I've seen in my Jewish community of the liminal relationship to whiteness, I guess would be one way I'd put it. It's like, are we white? Are we not? And I even asked the rabbi when I met him, I was like, what do you put on the form? And he says, other. When he asks, are you white? And he said, but I don't know how to relate to it because Jews are Mizrahi, they're Sephardim, they're not, it's not the color of your skin. But what you have to understand, and which Erica says so clearly, is that you don't get to choose, something I said at the beginning. When the white nationalists name you as the other, it doesn't matter what your skin color is, you're still the other, And this part kind of blew my mind, but also clarified things for me a little bit. Both the struggle that I see in the Jewish community when it comes to this discussion, but also the importance of understanding where the hate comes from and how that all fits together.
I mean, I think we've hit the point that there is this nexus among racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny, homophobia. And also there's the potential for an extremely strong anti-hate coalition to defeat it all. So having spent your time in this, talking to all these people, what lessons have you internalized from all this?
Well, this idea that, firstly, that this is a threat, I think is important, that a lot of us don't understand. There has been, the last 50 years have in some ways been very good to Jews. There's been a lot of economic achievement that's happened within the Jewish community, and there's been a sort of sense of assimilation that the Jews have experienced with what I would call the dominant culture. And I don't want to get hyperbolic about it, but you get scared that has happened in the past before too. So firstly, that the fear is real was something that I needed to hear as when I started out, that this is something to be scared of, it's something to understand better and not to dismiss. A lot of what I understood about anti-Semitism seemed crazy, honestly, when I first heard about it. It's like, what are you talking about space lasers? What are you talking about, puppets? Like that, no, I know this guy. He doesn't have any, he's not working a puppet string, that kind of thing. But this is real because it's so, it's got such a history. It's really terrifying how deep it goes. It took me a while to learn that. I think everybody needs to relearn that now, in this moment, and understand it. It's not new, but it's kind of new to kind of reopen that. And the other thing I learned was that this coalition stuff, I mean, it's going to sound, corny in a way, but it's like you got to show up, you got to hear other people, you got to empathize with these groups. Like, what do Jews and blacks and the LGBTQ community have in common? It's like, well, we're all othered by this other group. Maybe nothing else, but that's a thing. That's a real thing, and you got to show up and stand up for the people with you. This feeling that Eric and you guys all describe about, they coming in and they're coming into your house and breaking up your family. I've gone into places and felt uncomfortable, like this wasn't my scene. I know what that feels like. People can relate to that. They can relate to this feeling of like, I'm not allowed to be in this space. I don't want that to be our democracy. This feeling of like that leap that we're making to where like, I'm not included into this country, or, it's just, these are big issues. So it takes getting out of your silos, as everybody said already, to connect with others, to see this with fresh eyes. And maybe it's as simple as that. It's not a new thing. It's just what everybody has said.
And sometimes to connect over a shared love outside yourself, like it's ska music or punk music or whatever it is, can bring people together.
Music, yeah.
Just music.
I do wish we could there was a thing that music meant to me about, it spoke to me before I knew anything about politics, right? That was pre-politics. It's just like an energy, a thing. I see this person's into that. They're wearing the right clothes. They're wearing the right thing. That's my crew. That feeling where you kind of like draw circles around it is so important. So music has, it's scary to play music and be political now, but this idea of like punk stuff was deeply political when I was coming up in it, and I loved that about it. It was political and also sort of outside of the usual. It didn't fit in a clique for me. I understand like when you feel like you're anyway, dude, that's what I found in this scene. I hope other people can learn something from this and bring it to, like, when the Trump stuff was coming up and it was getting really dark. That's what I was thinking. I wish the music could help me here.
It's so powerful, and it just resonates. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to open it up to you all. I'm imagining this is a room full of people who have opinions. Just looking at you, I can tell who has a question.
Are there any plans to expand it into something that might be a feature?
Well, I had never made a short film before. It would be the first answer. I've made maybe many hundreds of little short internet videos, but not what I'd call a short film. This was a short film. I felt like I was trying to make a feature film and cutting away everything I loved so I could just fit it into these 11 minutes. It feels to me like I don't know how to make a short film still. I really just want to make a feature film, basically. And I think that there's so much in here, so much that I learned. Just this idea of like the music subculture stuff, like there's this, Eric touched on it, but there's the mixed martial arts, the MMA scene, there's the motorcycle scene. These are subcultures where people are drawn to it for a lot of the same reasons people were drawn to the punk scene. Preppers, these people who are now worried about the apocalypse and sort of. These are interesting communities where I see a lot of the same DNA, I think, as what I saw in the punk scene. So this idea of like, these movements start on the fringes of society and move to the mainstream. We're seeing that right now. There's lessons we can learn if we empathize with those subcultures on the fringes and we bring those lessons to the mainstream that I think can help us all. I think there's a story there.
I would love to see that feature film, personally.
Hey, okay, let's do it.
Yes.
Hi. So watching this, thank you so much. This was fascinating. I watched it and I was like, wow, that feels like utopia in terms of how people are connecting, and there's like this whole coalition, people are working together. It feels very different from what's going on right now, what we're watching. Specifically, some of the really anti-Semitic rhetoric coming out of the left. And we're seeing that, for example, the Black Lives Matter, like graphic that circulated earlier last week. It's really scary to see. I've personally been pretty scared by it, and we're standing at the Holocaust Museum. So what do you make of it? What's your take on it? And how do you understand it in the context of the history that you put forward tonight?
Well, I can start, but I'd be interested in everybody's take. I think this moment right now, whenever you talk about the conflict, you have to start by saying you're against murder, which is insanity. The fact that, like, I stand against the murder of innocent civilians in any way is a crazy thing to have to say at the beginning of whatever comes after that. And what it means to me is that everybody's coming at this with such suspicion over where the people that they're talking to stand. There's no love, there's no generosity in that framing. So if we in this room come to the discussion of Israel and Palestine with the discussion of, we have to say at the outset that we don't agree with the murder of innocent civilians, I find that personally very difficult. I would find it very difficult to have a conversation with people who saw things the other way. And that means we're unable to hear one another because there's such suspicion about where you're sitting on that topic. So I will say, beyond that, without that kind of basic understanding, how is any real dialogue or message beyond that important? What these folks found here, don't have the exact story, but my guess is a lot of these folks were very different from one another who were in this community, didn't share a lot in common. In fact, might have hated each other maybe 95% of the time, beat each other up possibly. I don't know, but there was also like some sense of shared mission and love that they found, So how you flip that script from such suspicion and animosity to something more positive, it's so urgent, and I don't really know how you get there, but that's all I got right now.
Want to add anything?
What a hornet's nest to walk into, too, right? I mean, what could you possibly say that doesn't, light the world on fire?
It also shows you that this...
That wasn't a good metaphor.
I mean, it's also a reminder that these issues remain unresolved. And until we find our way to building this coalition without internal divisions, maybe we continue to have to face it until we find the way for the coalition, everybody in this coalition, to see each other for who we are. Yes, here's a question.
I'm going to follow up on that because I can agree with everything in the film, but you talk about a coalition. I'm not really sure what coalition you're referring to because I think there is hate on the extreme right and I think there's hate on the extreme left. And I think we need to talk about both of them and not just pretend it's only on one side. And you said things are good for Jews. I mean, this was the most horrific week and a half that the Jewish people have had since the Holocaust. And people feel an existential threat. And the people that maybe you're referring to as the coalition are cheering on some of this stuff. So I think, to be honest, we have to call it out on all sides.
I was referring to the coalition in the film of people in the punk movement who had every reason to see each other as the enemy and come at it with bigotry and suspicion, and decided that if I suffer at the hands of Nazis, you suffer, so we better put our mutual interests ahead of our differences. And my point is that there is I don't know, I cover this war and I cover all this stuff and I'm talking about this a lot, so I'll just say what I see. I have a lot of friends in Europe who tell me, good, you American Jews, now you get it. We've been having this conversation for 100 years. We know who's who and what's what, and it's on the right and it's on the left, and we know who our friends are and we know who our friends aren't, and it's time you woke up. That's that perspective. Another perspective, you talk to people in the Middle East and they're like, this has always been the struggle, and now the whole world is in it. And their point of view, I think, is until we resolve, to some extent, and what my point is until we all see that anti-Semitism and bigotry and Islamophobia and misogyny all come from fear and hate and panic about ourselves and our world, we're going to continue fighting this fight. And I think that what we see in the right and the left in this country is terrifying. I don't have the answer for how to solve it. But I do think that some of this gives us an opening, an aperture to investigate how we can begin.
In the 80s and the 90s, and when we were fighting Nazis, I was a teenager, and we had some issues that relate to some of what you said. A lot of us on the left didn't agree with each other. There were communists, there were people who were super violent, there were people who were pacifists, and what we did as teenagers was we created points of unity, certain things that we would agree on. And, we came up with, in regards to the Nazis, we said we go where they go. We weren't going to let them have any unchallenged space. We agreed to defend other anti-fascists regardless of, if we had political differences with them. We agreed to not, go to the police if our problems. We didn't think that they were really there to help us. We agreed to support women's rights. But as teenagers, coming up with some points of unity helped us to, a workaround towards all of our internal fighting and disagreements about all the other stuff, because we just kind of tried to decide for us in our community what were the big important things. And so, that's what we did.
That's lovely.
Well, thank you for this, first of all, because I think it gives us all a chance to get in the ring a little bit, and I think that really is the point, a big takeaway for what we can do. Eric said something in the piece you played with the rabbi at the end, where he just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Me too, is simple. I think, this idea of how to understand race as a construct is, it takes a lifetime, I think, to really get underneath the hood. Eric spent his life doing it. If he was here, I think he'd be the one to answer this question. So honestly, he's the best one to speak about it. This week, I remember talking to him, there was this article that came out. I think that, there's no genetic evidence for race, so they're trying to use that as some way to, like, what does this mean legally, or how do we sort of talk about this? This was fascinating to me because I really wanted Eric's perspective on this as well. So you get when you get into this stuff and you get into like, okay, race is a construct, and, you know, as a people who are not defined by our skin color but are still have this othering, how does that relate to like the blood quantum stuff for Native people? I'm doing a project with Native people now. That's really heavy. So how do we think about this stuff when you talk to almost every young Jewish person who says, you know, and black people who, you know, very rightfully have, you know, grievances about, you know, they don't feel like they're experiencing the same. And for Jews to say that, it feels like co-opting the conversation to a lot of black people. So how do we sit in that space? Eric's really much, much better at talking about it. It's important to not ignore these topics. So I won't what I'll say is I want to go there too. I want to go have that discussion. It's scary. I feel unsafe, and that makes me feel like I want to know more about it. That's why I love having, Eric on this panel would have been, the thing to go here. So I don't want to pretend like I have, wisdom. I don't in this particular respect, other than thank you for pointing that out. This is the place we all have to talk and struggle with, and I, am desperate for that conversation, honestly, because I feel like it's missing in the culture.
It's very Jewish to answer a question with more questions. Very good. Very good. Let's bring in a woman.
Are you taking your panel and the movie on the road to younger populations, like colleges right now? The kids are struggling, in general, especially under the, confines of they've grown up or speaking to people who are different than them. That's their group, that's their culture too, in a different way that they've come together. So accepting what
I think, I don't know if you had a chance the intro from Francine at the beginning sort of brought up this idea of, the idea of Reboot Ideas. And the thing is also I didn't know what to do with a short film, to be candid with you, so this is the right way to do it. It starts a conversation. And the idea of taking it on the road and talking about it with music, with subculture, taking it into all these different communities that don't agree with any of the folks in this room, and showing it to them and seeing what they think. The idea of showing it to young people, the idea of showing it to thought leaders, bring it. Let's have these kind of difficult conversations. I hope we all feel a little bit uncomfortable and then grow a little bit from it at the end.
Love that. Yes.
So it's another comment, not a question, but when I was a little kid in the 60s, I always felt that Jews were allies to the civil rights movement and black people in general. And it's been so depressing and disheartening in the last 10, 20 years to watch it just decay. And so your movie is giving me like the first glimmer of hope. I haven't even seen any hope between like what Ye says, and I mean it's so depressing. I'm like, we're your allies, like aren't we? Like, are we in this together? And so this is the first time I'm like, thank you for sparking some positivity.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, in the back.
I have a question prior to that. It feels like there's something to build from that to have the conversation. My question has to do with, you talked about that they were successful in pushing the punks out. Yet I heard in the introduction, and I don't know a lot about it, but it seemed like there was also some violence involved in the evolution of that story. So if maybe you could help explain kind of how they were successful in pushing them out.
John, that feels like you.
Well, there's definitely a lot of violence in my story. I mean, when we started resisting the Nazis in our music and punk and skinhead scenes in Portland, Oregon, it started with their violence. It started with them showing up at punk rock shows and attacking random people. And we originally organized to defend each other from them. And honestly, there was a real change in the power dynamic when we when we started to understand that we could take that power, instead of going to a show and feeling scared or worried about what might happen, once we had a group and we were organized against the Nazis, and we could go to the show and say, they better worry if they want to come around here, what will happen to them. And, you know, as a young person, flipping that power dynamic felt really good. And we ended up involved in a lot of violence. And, you know, I ended up in a conflict with neo-Nazis that was supposed to be a fight. It turned into a gunfight. One of those guys, one of the neo-Nazis was killed in that situation, and I decided to turn myself in and make a confession, and I spent my 20s in prison and on parole. And, you know, I believed as a young person that it was always morally correct to take direct action in defense of another. However, that didn't serve me very well. I had no idea that the consequences might be death, might be prison, might be getting, you know, seriously injured. I was just a kid. So I would want to advise the young people of this generation to seek other avenues first, you know.
My big questions going into this film was, when did how did this anti-Semitism get into the punk scene that, you know, somebody called it a utopia or something? I got in it because it didn't feel like it had labels. It felt like you could be whatever you wanted in terms of the punk scene. That's what I came into. So when the neo-Nazis were coming in, this question is like, well, where'd that come from? And there was this kind of sense that Eric, I asked this of Eric, and he said, it's always there. It's been there for a long time. This anti-Semitism is always under the surface. Racism is always there. It's not like in the last 40 years, suddenly everybody became more racist and anti-Semitic. This stuff was always there. But you're absolutely right. People can go either way. And when you're in this movement, as I was, and we were talking about this, I was talking about this with John a little bit before the panel and before the film, and you could feel people could go either way. These were angry kids, and where is the resources in terms of the mentorship? Well, in the Portland scene, they were on the neo-Nazi side. They were organized, and this was like, you know, moths going to the light, these kids who are frustrated and don't know where to turn. And where was that on the anti-hate side? It was nowhere. There was no one organizing. So whenever you heard the story of the punk movement, you heard the story of neo-Nazis. You did not hear the story of the Sharps, the skinheads against racial prejudice. You didn't hear about this story because nobody's talking about the people fighting back. They weren't organized. There was no resources behind it. So if everybody here is interested in one takeaway that I had from this is like, all that bad stuff's there all the time. Where the resources go, where the mentorship goes to kind of help people, you know, see their way out, that's the difference. You got to give them you got to organize, you got to have the resources behind it.
We're all looking to the allies here, and thank you for your allyship, and thank you, and thank Eric. There's also action in us coming together, and the fact that, you know, how it's almost 100 years ago now, these rooms weren't happening in Berlin, right? And people weren't coming out and saying, what are we going to do? How do we talk? How do we speak across the differences? How do we find allies? How do we build coalitions? So this is action. And this will lead to other conversations that are action and protection and community. So thank you for your action in coming out. Thank you, Jake, for this exceptional film. So powerful.
Thank you for coming out. Thank you, guys.
Tonight's event was informing, mind-opening, and necessary.
It was just a really powerful experience to see the film, especially with what's going on in the world right now.
And I think this film does such a great job speaking about how to handle that conflict and how to come together.
A lot that we can do together in a time.
How do we take that stand about breaking our own comfort zones and going and talking and understanding and putting our place in other people's shoes and other people's situations to understand what is that they fear and how can we mitigate those fears by communicating with each other.